So, as Sue and Zoe have said, my name is Krysia. I am an autistic and dyspraxic and general Betty Spaghetti is a good way to describe my joints person. I'm based down in Kent. I've lived in Kent most of my life, and I've been part of various kind of different church circuits and parishes and different kind of ways through different denominations. So I got interested in how autistic people experience church and what we can do as churches to facilitate inclusion and better welcome and empowerment through kind of two angles, really. Firstly, through my own experience of being excluded from my parents' church and seeing some of the difficulties occurring and the need for information and dialogue and how that can be really helpful. But also, I did an undergraduate in languages. I then worked in Germany for a bit, came back, didn't know what to do. I went back to university and I kind of got really interested in researching autistic people within religion. That's ended up to where I am now, doing a PhD on autistic people's experiences of inclusion and belonging in churches and mosques. I now also teach some fantastic undergrads who I have later this afternoon, which I'm looking forward to. And I'm sure you guys are going to be just as good, if not better, than some of the undergrads in terms of some of the discussions we're going to be able to have. I like swimming. I like cats. I like Pokemon Go. I spend a lot of time walking around on Pokemon Go. I guess it would be really good at this point for you to introduce yourself in the chat, because it would be really great to see what kind of people we have here today, if that's possible. I'm also just going to open up the chat so I can read it as well. And if you've got any problems using the chat, raise your hand or let Zoe or Sue know, and I'm sure they can help. Great. I'm just going to let you finish typing up in the chat. And I'm just going through and liking it to show that I've read all your bits and bobs. Fantastic. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue talking. If you want to continue typing, or if you have kind of thoughts or questions you want to kind of ask throughout the session, feel free to pop them in the chat. It's generally easier for me if I can have either them written down or hold on to at the end. That would be really fantastic. And don't hesitate to ask questions if you have questions, because I think that's really important. So what I am going to ask quickly, and I think some of you have said this in your introductions to yourself, is what do you currently know about autistic people or autism. Some of you have said you have autistic family or you work with autistic people. If you've not said that as yet in the chat, it would be grand if you could pop a couple of words about what you currently know or what your experience so far has been. Fantastic. I'll just let you finish typing, but it sounds like we have a real variety of different people and experiences, which I think is really useful in terms of some of the discussion and some of the things I'm going to share today, partially about how I experience church as an autistic person, but also about what autistic people are kind of more generally, and the things that we can do within church to make our churches actually not only more accessible for autistic people, but actually what we can do that actually is going to benefit everybody in what we do. So I guess one key part in terms of what it means to be autistic is that we are part of human diversity. There have always been autistic people. The example I've used when teaching before is Pluto existed before we knew Pluto existed in 1930. It's just that we found at that point that Pluto existed. So there's always been autistic people. It's more that we're now at a point since the mid-20th century of recognizing that there are people who are autistic and that they are part of human diversity. Autistic people have different social communication skills to non-autistic people. So one key one is eye contact. You'll notice when I'm talking, I do look at the camera. In fact, I find looking at the camera very strange and very weird, but it kind of, the light on my Mac burns into my eye. But often when I'll talk to people, I will look slightly past them or over the top of them. So I personally find eye contact quite difficult. As autistic people, we can sometimes use our words slightly differently. So some autistic people will be very much more direct in how they speak. Some may find metaphor quite difficult and generally say what they mean. Our body language can be a little bit different as well. And in essence, as part of how we communicate differently, we experience the world differently as well. And when I say we experience it differently, it's more that we experience it differently to this ideal norm of a non-autistic person. So we might have sensory differences. So certainly for me, I have quite a lot of sound sensitivity, and I found the sound with the mic going on just now quite difficult, just as it is. One example for me is actually in my parents' church. That it's quite a big old Methodist church. I can hear all the sounds bouncing off all the different parts because it's a really high ceilinged church. Light is another one some autistic people might be overwhelmed by. Taste, so different foods and textures. Balance is one that's often not considered a lot. I mean, the amount of times I spend walking into things, dropping things. PE teacher once said to my parents that it's a surprise I can even, I have no balance at all. I don't know why your daughter bothers doing anything in PE. Well, I would have liked to have not done PE, but the government said otherwise. And proprioception as well, in terms of knowing when you're sat on a chair, for example, knowing where your body starts and stops and that sort of thing. So how we experience the world in terms of how we communicate and how we understand what comes in is different to a non-autistic folk. And it's really important, I guess, here to say that it's not worse, it's not wrong, it's different. And because of the differences that we have, and this is informed by the way our brains work. So many autistic brains are more monotropic than non-autistic brains. So the triangle on the left could be almost seen to be a non-autistic brain. There's a really big funnel. We can have lots of different things going in. So you could have, for example, you could be listening to me talk, and you could be eating your lunch, and you could be having, your phone might be vibrating in your pocket, and that would all be manageable and dealable with the wider funnel of information that's going in. For someone who's monotropic, so autistic brains or autistic people are generally more monotropic, There's also some discussion around people who are ADHD being more monotropic as well. There's a smaller funnel, so there's less stuff that's able to go in, and we generally tend to have more kind of narrower interests as a result, which may account for, if we go back, experiencing the world differently. If you consider you're listening to me and your phone's buzzing and you're eating your lunch, that's a lot of sensory information perhaps going in. If we have the smaller funnel, it might be that when your phone buzzes, your brain can't focus and your brain can't handle it. And due to this kind of the funnel that exists, we may therefore find that known situations and routines are easier, because we haven't got to process as much going in through the wider funnel. And this is because there will be a lower brain load. And when we look at some of the more kind of psychology stuff to do with autism, people might say that autistic people prefer routines and they like people to be known, to kind of know what they're doing and this sort of things. That's what we're talking about with known situations and routines. And the reason there is that preference is that there's less thinking of what you've got to do for each step one at a time. I often find that if I can do things automatically and it's a routine, it actually takes a lot less effort for me to do it. Let's go on to the next slide. And I guess it's really important at this point to say what autism is. And somebody who researches autism, who is autistic, who has come across varying kind of things said about autistic people which aren't helpful, it's really important to know what it is and what it isn't. In fact, only yesterday I was cited in a student's dissertation in America that said that autism was a mental health disorder. And I did raise my eyebrow slightly at that, because that's one thing that autism is not. It's not an illness. It's not a mental health disorder or condition. It's the way someone's brain and body works. Some people may describe this as a neurotype or a neurology, but it's effectively part of who you are and how you process the world and understand it. Autism is also not something to be cured or healed, and it's really important to, within a kind of church and Christian setting, to kind of understand the ramifications of this. Certainly this was something I found when I did some interviews with churchgoers as part of my master's dissertation, and something that did come up in how people kind of understand autism or autistic people was this thing around wanting to pray for people to cure and heal them to so that they didn't suffer, not realizing that actually you can be autistic, and if you're in the right environment and have the right support, actually it's not going to be as difficult. Autism isn't a tragedy. It's not something that makes you less. And I think this is really important when we consider some of the biblical and theological underpinnings. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. And a lot of the work that's going on around the image of God and Imago Dei is actually on how autism is part of being in the image of God, and autistic people are not less in any way. And I think that's really fundamentally important when we think of not just autistic people, but neurodivergent and disabled people more broadly. It's a lot of the time the difficulties that people face are what I would call as an academic socially constructed. So things we do in the systems we have set up, in the way we do things and the processes we have, and the way we've set up life in society, that actually will stop people being able to do what they want, to take part, feel included, and all that angle. And autism isn't isn't caused by the fall or anything like that. It just is. It's part of natural diversity, as Galatians 3:28 would single. You're all one in Christ Jesus. And I've alluded to this a little bit so far, but I've kept it quite autism centric to begin with. But autism is part of neurodiversity. And in fact, everybody is part of neurodiversity. I'm part of neurodiversity. Zoe's part of neurodiversity. Sue's part of neurodiversity. All you fantastic listeners today are part of neurodiversity. All my students are part of neurodiversity. And we are all part of that. And neurodiversity is the variety of what Nick Walker calls neurocognitive functioning. So the way our brains work, we all have brains that work in different ways, and they're all different. The neurodiversity paradigm, so kind of the paradigm is basically a way of thinking about the way brains work, and the neurodiversity paradigm values all brains. So there isn't one healthy brain, so my brain isn't worse or better than Zoe's brain or Sue's brain or any of yours or any of my students. Everybody is valued and wonderful as they are and as they come. And it doesn't mean to say that they don't have difficulties or struggles, or that things are challenging, or that their family might need more support, or that there's difficulties. It just means that they are valued and wonderful as they are. People who diverge from what we call this norm, so most people we would call who are not autistic, we call them neurotypical. People who do diverge from the norm we call neurodivergent. So autistic people are neurodivergent, people who are ADHDers are neurodivergent, dyspraxic people, dyslexic people, people with Tourette's, people with severe mental illness, lots of different folk can be included under neurodivergent. You're not just necessarily neurodivergent from birth, you can acquire it through life as well. For example, a severe brain injury. Someone who has a severe brain injury would be classed as neurodivergent. And as I've said before, neurodivergent people are all made in God's own image. And this is even though we're, as neurodivergent people, we are also different to each other, and we all may have quite different needs. We are all made in God's image. And this reminded me of Nancy Easland's Disabled God, which actually I've just brought up on my work computer because I wanted to make sure that I had it completely correct. That having a disability is part of oneself. It's not a divine punishment. It's not an opportunity for healing. It just is. And that's what neurodivergent people's brains are. And that's what autism is. It's just is. And I guess at this point, it's quite useful to think about how we talk about autistic people as well, especially when we think about the different experiences we've had, the different things we know, the different people we know. People may have different preferences. I've taught students who've worked in what we call services. So they might have worked in a supported living service, or they might have worked for the NHS and supported people. And people also use different things at different times in their lives. Generally, autistic people are spoken about with what we call identity first language, so autistic people rather than person with autism. There is a lot of kind of history behind why they mean so different things. Research since 2016 has elucidated that most autistic people prefer autistic person. But it's always really important when you're working with someone to follow their lead, because I've known autistic people to be individuals who've preferred person with autism. But if you're writing documents or anything like that, it's generally good practice, and there's an evidence base for this, for identity first language. when we talk about different types of support needs, it's really important that we are quite specific. So if you have an autistic person who has a co-occurring learning disability, or an autistic person who has other medical needs, or an autistic person who perhaps is face blind, and I'll explain what face blindness is in a minute, it's better to be really specific rather than just say, well, someone is kind of high functioning or low functioning. Sometimes people say that to determine how much kind of support someone might need, or how people might be perceived, and how much how inverted commas disabled they might appear and how look. It's important to note that people's capacity fluctuates. So at the moment, I have to sit here in my office talking a donkey off about things I'm really passionate about. But last week when I moved house, I had a really difficult time, and I had meltdown after meltdown. So I really got quite distressed, and I had to go lay in bed. I screamed, I put headphones on, because I just could not cope with the amount of change and overwhelm and processing that I had to do. So that's really good signifier of how we fluctuate in our support needs. And I think that's important across the board for all kind of folk. Obviously, anybody who moves house, it's really, really stressful. But if you have the monotropic brain funnel, that's going to clearly have an impact. So as I've said, it's better to be more specific, and I think it's more respectful as well. And again, to follow the person's lead is really, really important. I wanted to include this fantastic image from Autism Sketches. I thought it was really, really good on how the autism spectrum is not linear. So it's not that someone is less autistic or very autistic and kind of, for example, today I'm orange flavour of autistic and someone down the road is blue. It's very, very personalised. I've always seen it as like almost a mixing board. Like at some churches, they'll have like a sound deck at the back if there's quite a bit of money. Obviously, not all churches will have that. But how you might fiddle with all different things to get the perfect sound output. The kind of autism spectrum is a bit like that. So some people may have higher impact of their sensory kind of input and how they process that. Some people may have more difficulties with how they communicate and their social differences. Some people may really struggle with routines and really need things really because it really overwhelms them. Think of the kind of the funnel, the monotropic funnel again. And a pie chart like that or a mixing board shows you how individualized it is and how it can change over time as well. At this point, it's really useful to say that autistic people, like I said at the beginning, we've always existed, a bit like Pluto before we knew Pluto existed. We've always existed in churches as well. And this is something that Anne Memmott says in her welcoming autistic people into our churches document, which I have the link for at the end of the slides. And I'll also pop it in the chat as well, because that's a really, really helpful document. We've always existed in churches, but not everybody who's autistic has known they're autistic. As I said, it's really only been since the mid-20th, late 20th century that we've under this thing we call autism has kind of been discovered in inverted commas, and then we've applied it onto autistic people. And there'll be people who will have had no idea. So my granddad is autistic. He had no idea he was autistic, and he got. I remember him telling me once at school that he got the cane for backchatting a teacher when he was actually just asking clarification using autistic communication, saying, "Do you want me to do this?" and got a strap across the wrist for that. So they've always been here. And the reason I've used the term lost generations is because how we identify people has radically changed. And when this thing we call autism first entered kind of some of the discourse, it would have mainly been children. It was seen as something for children and mainly young boys. But actually, we've come to realization that anyone can be autistic, any background, any gender, age, you name it. There's no limits on it. And there's also the consideration that not necessarily everyone's understood what it means to be autistic, and that's still the case now. But even so, 50 years ago, people would have been labelled as weird, eccentric, a bit odd. In the case of my granddad, awkward, shy, lazy. There's lots of different ways which we use to describe people. And we still use them now, but we now understand that actually being autistic might be the reason why people have these difficulties or to express themselves the way they do, and then get those labels instead. And where there is this lack of understanding, not being out, so not disclosing you're autistic, you get called weird, odd, peculiar, awkward. But when you're out and people know you're autistic, there's still quite a lot of stigma associated with being autistic, where people see it as a negative thing when it just is. And when we place some of the theological ideas that I spoke about at the beginning, actually, when we consider that, it means that perhaps we should be more understanding. And this can lead to a double bind, which I've called being an impossible subject, where you lose out either way. The attitudes of how we do church can make it quite difficult for autistic people. So this can be the way we have things set up at church, what we expect of people, what we do. Lots of different things can make it difficult, and it's what I would call socially constructed in a very formal academic term. So it's what we do and how we enact it on the ground, rather than some inherently in someone else being broken or less or wrong. It is important to say at this point, though, that churches need autistic people. There are some fantastic things that autistic people have done within churches. On the second bullet point, there was some examples within Anne's document, which I'll link at the end, on all the different things that autistic people are likely to have been a part of within the church. So you could have some architects who built the church who are autistic, musicians. Many autistic people have what we call perfect pitch, so they can be really skilled musicians. People could be at the front of the house, talking to people, really gregarious, really welcoming. I know quite a few autistic people who are really, really talkative and who'll go and talk to everybody. People could be supporting administration and bookings, especially in this day and age where we generally hire out parts of church buildings or halls. Some autistic people are really good, what we could call systemizers, so they're really good with patterns and admin work. Autistic people can and have done all of these things. And as we're all made in God's image, a church that excludes people, kind of groups of people, whether it be by accident or on purpose, and a lot of the time, in my experience, it's by accident, is missing the wonderful diversity of God's creation and the wholeness of God's church. As when we come together, one and two or more, we are God's church. And that also signifies we bring all our ideas and our attitudes with us, become part of that gathering. So the church is incomplete if we exclude any group of people, and this particularly would focus on autistic people. And Brett Webb Mitchell wrote a fantastic book in 1994, which I read for part of my master's, and it hasn't aged at all. And you think in 2023 it would have aged a bit, but it actually hasn't. And he said that they have been set at the margins of the church because the church does not know what else to do with them. In doing so, the community is no longer composed of people in all their richness, weakness, poverty, of people who accept and forgive each other, people who are vulnerable and one another and to God. And this was about disability more broadly rather than autism specifically, but I think this can be applied to anybody who's been inadvertently or kind of on purposely pushed out of a church setting. And as I've said, how we do things and how the way things are set up can actually exclude people from not being able to access the space. And when we think back to some of the ways autistic people can process and understand the world, well, I said things about things like sound, smell, light, touch, all these things can impact how we do church, because church can be too loud for some people. For example, I said about all the noise bouncing around in the ceiling. Church can be too smelly. I mean, it's not something that I've experienced. I grew up in a Baptist and a Methodist tradition. So incense and other things aren't really used, but some churches might use incense, which people find really difficult. But at the same time, there'll be other people who will actually really enjoy this, almost what we would call sensory seeking, and really like the smell of incense. So it's a real fine line almost to walk, where it can be really too much and people can seek it. Too busy, this is something that's come up a lot in my research. I've done interviews with autistic Christians and Muslims, and one of the things people have said kind of over and over again almost was this feeling of some places being too busy. There's too many people, or there's too much sensory information for them to process, and they get overwhelmed, and then they're not going back into church or mosque, or they're finding smaller groups that fit them better, because it is just too much for them. Difficult to recognize people due to face blindness. So face blindness is where we might not, so if I use Sue and Zoe as an example, I would, if I saw them in the street, having met them online, I'd probably recognise them. I'm not face blind, but I know Anne Memmott, who wrote the documents, but I keep referring back to about welcoming people into churches. Anne is face blind, and if I bumped into Anne in the street, she might not recognise me because she can't put face to name with the different face. So that can be a way that people could be quite excluded, especially if people assume that you'll just see someone at church and you'll keep recognizing them. Actually, that's not necessarily the case. Could be stressful if there's no order of service, or people deviate from it and decide they're going to do a 10-minute long set of prayers rather than the allocated 5 minutes. It could be too unpredictable. So if we do something like the peace, where it's certainly something we do in Methodist tradition, where get up and go around and shake hands with everybody, if everybody all of a sudden gets up out the seat and wanders around, I actually find that really, really overwhelming and a bit too much. Like, can't you just say the peace to the people around you rather than getting up and going all the way around the church? That's something I find quite difficult. And it can also be quite traumatic if you ask for example, accommodations in regards to sort of the volume, or if there's a quiet space for you to sit and you're ignored or you're silenced, that can be quite traumatic. So in essence, we kind of see that church might not always be 100% accessible, but there are lots of small things that we can do that actually don't cost lots of money and don't cost lots of time. Because the way I've described it so far, it might be that in a way it can be quite exclusionary, but there are definitely things we can do. There is no one perfect church for autistic people. There's going to be different things for different people, but there are many things we can do to make church better, to benefit everybody. Lots of natural light might be really good. So if you've got, for example, really big windows, making sure you make use of those rather than cover them up with blinds and turn on internal lights might have flickering or give people migraines. If there's a quiet space at the back or in a different room people can retreat to and recharge, and that they can have as theirs, that can be really, really useful. Lots of autistic people really don't like hand dryers in bathrooms. The Dyson ones are awful. It just feels like your eardrums are being burnt, quite frankly. Maybe we could put some paper towels in on a Sunday instead of having the hand dryers on. Is the order of service really clear when people need to stand up or sit down, shake hands? that sort of thing, do anything, so the expectations are clear. And I think that's really useful for anyone who's new to church as well. That's something that I found in my research, is actually the expectations can shape if people are going to go back or not, if people know what they're doing and able to read what's going on. Could you put a bird's eye view layout on your church website or in your order of service? That could be really helpful. And when you're talking and writing, communicating clearly and accurately is really important. So the example I've used in the past is, how long do you think a minute is? And it's quite a good signal of people who can take how people understand language, because often people go, oh, I mean when I'm just done my task, or oh, whenever I'm ready. I'm like, you do know a minute can mean a minute, because I used to be the kind of person who'd sit there with a watch and time people for a minute. So it was really careful, being really specific and clear with our language is actually really beneficial for lots of people, including people with English as a second language. Because having studied both French and German to a relatively high level, I have an appreciation of how floral English is in comparison. It's quite useful when to think about what churches can do. Do we want to welcome, include, or affirm? And it's almost like 3 different levels, and they slightly overlap each other. But welcome is, can someone physically come into the building? Can they come in? Is someone going to say hello to them? Are they going to feel like they can physically, are able to come over the threshold and they can come in? Including people of, can autistic people be part of church life and be valued? Can people physically take part in things and psychologically and emotionally take part? And then there's affirming, are we reflecting the value of disabled people in church and how we do church? So when we're preaching, are we preaching things that are affirmative of disabled people and neurodivergent people's experiences? And we can affirm through both our actions, including the things on the previous slide, and how we talk about disability, neurodivergence, autism, all that angle, which I covered at the beginning, in terms of everybody being in God's image. No one is less, no one is broken. And we can affirm by listening to people and not minimizing the barriers people may face in church. And I think that's really important, as sometimes it can be really difficult if we don't have a lived experience of that particular barrier that we might just think isn't that much. Holding space can be really useful. And we can affirm by working with people, so autistic people and their families, if they are known to us, to help make those changes. It might be like with certainly the church I've was a part of for many years. I worked with them until it became there was a change in leadership and it became quite difficult, which actually helped both ways. It garnered my interest in my research. It also benefited the church leadership because it made them look good, and constantly being open to growth and different ways of doing things. I have 2 resources here. Anne's is in the chat, and this also is on the slide. And there was also a short guide that I wrote for the Autism, for Organisation of Autism Research, on welcoming autistic people to religious gatherings. And the 2 of them together quite neatly top and tail each other. And they cover some of the same stuff, some different stuff. Anne's goes into more detail, whereas mine's 4 quick bullet points. But together they make quite a nice nutshell of things that would be quite useful for churches to consider. And at this point, I was going to say that this may be a good point for reflection and for breakout groups. And it would be quite useful in your breakout groups to consider which of the things that I've discussed could your church do, or are there other things I've not said that you could do, and what are you taking away from today's session?